The rise of the authoritarian powers. And there's 4 of them, and they were all in Tiananmen Square on September 3rd of 2025 to commemorate the end of the Second World War, the defeat of Japan. It was Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia and Kim Jong-un of North Korea and President Pezeshkian of Iran. And it's not a formal alliance, but they have a lot of self-confidence. They believe in authoritarianism. So dictatorship, the rule of the few, by the few, of the many. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, they're all operating together. Putin crossed the border and has put hundreds of thousands of troops into Ukraine for one person, kill the Ukrainian state, and subsume it into a larger modern Slavic empire with Russia and Belarus and perhaps others. Who's helping him? China is providing, we thought, and when I was in government just 15 months ago, about 90% of the microelectronics, the dual-use technologies that power the Russian defense industrial base. So we have made the case that without that Chinese military support, Russia would be at a standstill and unable to actually prosecute this war.
大家好，这里是感人死绝频道。刚才这段威权国家崛起的论调听起来气势汹汹，仿佛只要把中国、俄罗斯、朝鲜和伊朗往同一张标签纸上贴，再把乌克兰战场上的所有问题都归到中国头上，世界就立刻真相大白了。尤其是那句没有中国的微电子产品，俄罗斯就打不下去，更像是一种先下结论再挑材料的政治话术。中国出现在纪念2战胜利的国际场合就被解读成威权抱团，而美国自己推动的军事行动、制裁和关税却被轻描淡写的放进秩序崩坏的背景里。究竟是谁在制造失序，谁又在借危机扩大对华竞争？本期正片我们将完整梳理伯恩斯大使关于伊朗、乌克兰和中美关系的长篇演讲，看看这位前驻华大使如何描绘所谓全球秩序瓦解，又如何评价中国的科技投入、经济实力与国际影响力。更重要的是，面对充满偏见的叙事，我们也会把事实、逻辑和立场一场一场一拆开。精彩内容现在开始。
And this is about risk. And it's about the future. And it's about how businesses need to prepare for this future, and countries do. We are moving, maybe slowly, but probably inexorably, from a world of order to a world of disorder. So what do I mean by that? Dan just talked about his dad, World War II. My dad was also in the Marine Corps in that war. I bet if we went around the room, fathers, mothers, maybe if you're on the younger side, grandparents, that greatest generation that brought us through the Great Depression and the Second World War. We are the inheritors of how they thought about the world and how it should be structured following the war. So our inheritance is a world of order. And it was the great insights, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt, who didn't live to see the end of the war, died April 12, 1945, but certainly with Harry Truman, with Dwight D. Eisenhower, with General George C. Marshall, Dean Acheson, and then even the younger people who fought in that war, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, Lieutenant Richard Nixon, 2 young naval officers in the war who became president. They had reflected on the fact most of them were alive during the First World War, 17 million dead. They were all in the Second World War. And now modern historians say about 70 million people died in the Second World War. So they looked at that and the rise of the fascist powers and the total war that it took from 1931, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, to September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese surrender. They said to themselves, we need to create a world of order. And they did. The United Nations system, the great powers would coalesce and actually work together to try to prevent a third world war, a Stalin invasion of Western Europe. The development banks, from the International Monetary Fund to the World Bank to the regional development banks, the whole tributary system of the United Nations from UNESCO to UNICEF to the UN Development Program. This would be a world of institutions that were solid, and we could actually plan globally around those institutions, and there were rules. The United Nations Charter, you cannot cross someone's border and take over the country, or try to, as Putin has tried to do. That's the brightest red line in this world of order. And conventions dear to the hearts of the ethics of Boston College. The United Nations Convention on Human Rights that enshrine freedom of speech and freedom of the press and the rule of law. Conventions about how to conduct a just war, which His Holiness Pope Leo has been talking about publicly and reminding us in a Catholic tradition of St. Augustine and a just war. And the United Nations Conventions against genocide, against the use of chemical weapons, reflect that kind of thinking. It was a world of order and of institutions from the late 1940s, I think until very recently, probably the last 5 to 10 years. It was not perfect. We had the Korean War. We had the Vietnam War. We lost 57,000 American troops in Vietnam. We had the Afghan War, a 20-year war. And we had the Iraq War. So it wasn't perfect. But you could plan, if you were in business, around the institutions, around the rules. There were safeguards, and there were, lines of authority that you wouldn't cross. And I'm sorry to depress you all on a beautiful Friday morning, but I think if you look at the world today, we're heading towards a world of disorder. A couple of examples, and there are many. One, that United Nations system, completely atrophied and ineffective. Have we heard anything, and he's a very good man, the UN Secretary General, has he been able to do anything to arrest Russian aggression? No. Or Iranian aggression in the Middle East, or the complex issues of malnutrition and poverty in the poorer parts of the world. The United Nations system is divided between the three democratic powers, Britain, France, and the United States, the people who hold the power in the Security Council, and the Russians and Chinese on the other side, and they veto each other, and we're both responsible for that. So that system cannot produce the kind of decision-making, order, planning, conflict resolution that we have needed. That's example number one. Example number two is probably the most important development in global politics in the last 10 years or so, the rise of the authoritarian powers. And there's 4 of them, and they were all in Tiananmen Square on September 3rd of 2025 to commemorate the end of the Second World War, the defeat of Japan. It was Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia and Kim Jong-un of North Korea and President Pezeshkian of Iran. And it's not a formal alliance, but they have a lot of self-confidence. They believe in authoritarianism. So dictatorship, the rule of the few, by the few, of the many. And if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, they're all operating together. Putin crossed the border and has put hundreds of thousands of troops into Ukraine for one person, kill the Ukrainian state, and subsume it into a larger modern Slavic empire with Russia and Belarus and perhaps others. Who's helping him? China is providing, we thought, and when I was in government just 15 months ago, about 90% of the microelectronics, the dual-use technologies that power the Russian defense industrial base. So we have made the case that without that Chinese military support, Russia would be at a standstill and unable to actually prosecute this war. North Korea has put 25,000 troops into eastern Ukraine to fight with the Russians against the Ukrainians. And Iran, Shahed drones. We know a lot about the Shahed drones from the last couple of months. Iran provided Russia with the drones that early in the war were a significant problem for the Ukrainians. So this is a real deal of authoritarianism rising up to say we're the future. And from my time in China, I can tell you, President Xi Jinping is often repeating, the East is rising and the West is falling. So the authoritarian case is, we are yesterday's story. We have been at the apogee of our power and now are on a downward slope, and they have the self-confidence and the resources and the unity in the authoritarian world. This is a real problem for us, especially at a time when democracy's on the back foot. You know, just go to Britain, France, Germany, Italy. There's been a positive development from my perspective in Hungary with the departure of Viktor Orban. But each of those other four democracies, the core four democracies in Western Europe, are in some trouble from parties to the extreme right. AfD in Germany, the Reform Party in the United Kingdom, and of course Marine Le Pen, and I say the French fascists, which may right now be in the lead for the presidential election in 2027. So we're at a perilous time when the self-confidence, the power, the movement, the initiative appears to be with the authoritarian countries. A third example of a world creeping towards disorder, and Professor Romer knows a lot more about this than I do, and I'm looking forward to his remarks and honored to be speaking with him today. It's the Wild West tariff reality around the world that's in place. I checked the figures the other day. In early January of 2025, the effective tariff rate of the United States, I think, was 2.6%. That's our average tariff rate towards the rest of the world. Now, even with the Supreme Court decision that has brought the tariff levels down, 11%. That's the highest rate we've had since 1943. And second only to what? To 1931, 32 with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. At Boston College, I did take economics. And I took more at Johns Hopkins. I was typical of a young person in the late 70s and 80s, and as a professional, all the way through till about 10 years ago, I, prayed the gospel of free trade. And I look back, and again, Professor Romer is the authority on this, be happy to hear from him about it, but there were problems with free trade, but boy, did it lift millions of boats. 800 million in China, people moving from poverty to the middle class. About half as many of that, but that's considerable in India. And the fact that globalization had its problems, but from an international economic point of view, brought us stability and prosperity that we had not seen.
一场金融会议最后却把我们的视线从校园带到了整个世界。从校友重聚、院系建设到金融、战争、科技与国际秩序，这场演讲真正讨论的并不只是某一个行业的前景，而是当世界正在快速变化时，个人、企业和国家究竟应该如何判断风险，又该如何守住方向。演讲一开始，主讲人反复感谢波士顿学院、卡罗尔管理学院以及塞德纳金融系。他所强调的一个细节非常值得注意，那就是一所大学的影响力从来不是靠一份排名、一个头衔或者某一位明星人物单独完成的，它来自一代又一代教师的教学，来自学生的努力，来自校友的回馈，也来自那些愿意长期投入公共事业的人。所谓成功，不只是个人走到了多高的位置，更重要的是走到那里之后，是否还愿意回头为曾经帮助过自己的地方继续添砖加瓦。这也是整场内容中一个容易被忽略却非常重要的主题。任何真正持久的成就都依赖共同体。金融系之所以能够保持竞争力，不只是因为有优秀的学者，更因为有人设定标准，有人承担责任，有人愿意协作，还有许多人在日复一日的工作中把追求卓越变成一种习惯。演讲中那句如果不想做到最好，又何必费劲，听起来像是一句口号，但它真正指向的是一种对职业、教育和公共责任的态度。卓越不是偶尔的高光，而是长期坚持后的结果。随后，话题从大学转向世界秩序。演讲者认为，第二次世界大战之后建立起来的国际体系，虽然从来都不完美，也经历过战争、危机和失误，但它至少提供了规则、机构和可供各方预期的边界。国家可以围绕这些规则进行贸易，企业可以据此制定计划，冲突也可以通过制度和外交争取缓和。如今，联合国体系效率下降，国际机构陷入对立，边界和规则不断受到挑战，保护主义重新抬头。 世界因此变得更加难以预测。这里真正需要我们思考的，并不是简单的把世界分成好与坏、强与弱，而是要看到秩序本身有多么脆弱。规则不会自动存在，机构也不会永远有效，他们需要各方共同维护，需要国家之间保留沟通渠道，需要在竞争之外继续寻找合作空间。一旦所有国家都只相信实力，只相信威胁，只相信短期利益，那么任何地区的冲突都可能通过能源、贸易、金融和供应链迅速传导到全世界。伊朗、乌克兰以及中美关系，正是这场演讲用来说明风险的3个切面。伊朗问题提醒我们，军事打击并不一定能够迅速改变一个政权，空中力量也不能替代政治方案。霍尔木兹海峡所牵动的能源运输，更说明局部冲突从来不只是局部问题。乌克兰战争则告诉我们，战争的走向不仅取决于兵力和装备，也取决于一个民族抵抗的意志，以及外部世界是否愿意持续提供支持。至于中美关系，演讲者将其概括为一场涉及军事、科技、贸易、投资和理念的长期竞争，但他同时也承认，两国必须避免失控，必须通过外交保持和平共处。这其中有一个非常现实的启示：竞争并不意味着切断一切联系，对抗也不等于拒绝所有合作。面对人工智能、量子计算、网络安全、太空和合成生物学等技术，国家需要提升自身能力，也需要建立更清晰的边界与沟通机制。特别是在拥有大规模杀伤性武器的时代，任何误判都可能带来无法挽回的后果。真正成熟的战略，不是只考虑如何赢得竞争，也要考虑如何避免竞争演变成灾难。演讲后半段谈到科技投入、大学研究和私营部门，这部分尤其值得重视。一个国家的创新能力往往来自政府、大学与企业之间的良性协作。政府提供长期支持，大学孕育知识和人才，企业将研究成果转化为产品和产业，三者缺一不可。如果只依赖企业追逐短期回报，基础研究可能无人承担；如果只依赖政府命令，创新又可能失去活力。如果削弱大学的科研基础，未来的技术竞争就会失去人才来源。科技竞争表面上是产品和设备的竞争，深层次其实是教育体系、科研制度、资本耐心和社会信心的竞争。而演讲者最后留下的希望也并不是对现实风险的否认。他提到年轻人、私营部门以及一个国家在危机时刻重新凝聚信心的能力。希望不是相信问题会自动消失，而是在看清问题之后依然愿意行动。无论是校园里的学生、企业里的工程师、研究机构里的学者，还是承担公共职责的政策制定者，他们都可能成为改变局势的一部分。历史上真正重要的转折，往往不是因为某个人拥有完美答案，而是因为一群人在困难面前没有放弃判断、责任和合作。所以回看这场演讲，我们听到的不只是对战争、贸易和大国竞争的担忧，也听到了一种更深的提醒：在时序加剧的时代，越需要冷静地理解事实，越需要尊重专业，越需要保留对话；在不确定性增加的时代，越不能只追逐即时利益，越要投资教育、科研。制度和人与人之间的信任，国家如此，企业如此，个人同样如此。世界不会因为我们的愿望而停止变化，但我们可以决定用什么方式面对变化，是被情绪推动，被短期叙事牵着走，还是在复杂信息中保持独立思考，在竞争与合作之间寻找边界，在风险与希望之间建立更可靠的判断。这或许才是这场演讲带给我们最重要的启示。本期内容就到这里。对于全球秩序的变化、伊朗与乌克兰局势、中美长期竞争以及科技和教育在国家发展中的作用，您有什么看法？欢迎在评论区留下您的观点，也欢迎把这期节目分享给更多关心国际局势的朋友。欢迎大家点赞订阅，继续观看更多精彩视频。